Action. Okay. So this discussion goes along with our Revolutionary War battle map. Okay, and it's on the battle campaigns of the American Revolution. This is kind of just an overview of the Revolutionary War. It's not a military history class. We focus more on the politics, the social side of it, and the economic side of history here. But a little military history is important, especially when we're talking about a war. Okay, and so we can kind of look at this as like this is the story of the Revolution, right? And I'm not going to get into again. We could spend a whole semester on the Revolutionary War, all right? But this is just kind of an overview so you guys can understand kind of how it played out, all right? All right. So you have your maps out. It will be helpful. So we're going to talk about the Revolutionary War in two phases, okay? And if we look up here in the map, we know that on the map on the wall, we know that early on there were some conflicts between Great Britain and the colonists in Massachusetts, right? And what were some of those first conflicts in 1775 before the Declaration was even written?
Boston Massacre.
Okay, Boston Massacre, 1770.
Tea Party. Boston Tea Party.
Okay, Boston Tea Party, good. But there were actually some armed conflicts where there was a Massachusetts militia armed with guns firing at the British and the British firing back.
Lexington and Concord.
Lexington and Concord, right? And so that was before the Declaration of Independence was actually even written, okay, before the Revolutionary War technically even began. There's a Battle of Bunker Hill, right? And then we go on a little bit to the Battle of Dorchester, Dorchester Heights. So there was some conflict going on between the British and the United States in Massachusetts. And we know that goes all the way back to the 1760s. So when Great Britain decided to declare war on the U.S. and the U.S. declared independence, and it was a mutual understanding that there was going to be conflict here, Great Britain started to develop a strategy about how exactly they were going to handle the colonists. Okay, and the colonists then tried to develop the strategy of their own. Andrew, what were you going to say?
Can I answer what the strategy?
So the question is, so what was the British strategy, right? Because that goes along with our map. So go ahead.
Wasn't it to intimidate them with overwhelming numbers and try to get them to surrender?
Okay, good. So we do know that one of the advantages the British had was a professional army that was much larger than Continentals, right? So intimidate them. Good. Adam?
I thought their plan was the British were gonna wait the colonists out because they knew they didn't have all the supplies and stuff to have a long war, so they were gonna wait them out when they were really desperate for supplies. The British were gonna be like, okay, let's take them down now.
Yes, I would say that early on that was part of their plan, but that was also part of the colonist plan too. Okay, the colonist strategy, part of the colonist strategy was to make the war last as long as it possibly could. And if you think about current conflicts, like Iraq and Afghanistan, right? The United States is still there. And the longer we stay there, the more tired people grow of sending our soldiers in. And so the Afghanis knew that we don't have to beat America. We just have to make this war last long enough that they get tired of it. That was kind of the colonist approach. Does that make sense? And we'll see that more especially in the South, all right, when we get to the Southern Campaign. All right? So good point. Mr. Velez?
I thought their plan was to take over the colonies to stop the rebellion and restore British control.
Yep, that's the overall goal, right? Put down the rebellion and restore British control. So, but the question is, how are they going to do that, right? What's the steps they're going to go through? Sydney?
Didn't they try to cut off New England from the middle colonies?
That's the first step of the plan, right? Okay, and Sydney?
They wanted to attack the Continental Army from different areas.
Good. So kind of like almost a 2-3-pronged attack to try to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. Okay.
Oh, they plan to take over Albany, New York, and the Hudson River.
Absolutely. Okay. So if we look at we got New England campaign here. Here is New England, right? And sometimes New York is considered part of New England. It depends on who you're talking to. All right. But basically, we'll kind of use the Hudson River here, Albany, kind of like this. This is New England over here, and this would be the rest of the colonies, right? Okay. Now, why did Great Britain feel that if they kind of, for lack of a better word, conquered New England, that would put an end to the Revolutionary War? Devin?
New England was the main force behind the rebellion.
Right. It starts pretty much here in Massachusetts, right? So if they could kind of separate New England and conquer it, occupy it, the British thought that would probably put an end to the Revolutionary War pretty quickly, right? So when we look at early battles in 1776, you have the Battle for Boston, which Great Britain won. Okay, and actually George Washington was there, and part of the Battle of Dorchester Heights. And so in 1776, Boston is actually occupied by the British. Okay? We move on a little bit later in 1776 to the Battle of Long Island. So the British sent some forces from Boston. They also sent some forces over from England, and they start to now focus on the second major city in kind of what's New England, and that's New York. Okay, so there's the Battle of Long Island, which Americans lost again. And Washington was forced to retreat into New York City, into Manhattan. And so we have the Battle of New York shortly after that. Okay? In which the Americans lost again. Now, New York City was not the huge, metropolis that we know today. New York, the city, was really only on one end of the island, down where all like the big buildings are, down by like where the World Trade Center is. That was really kind of only New York City. And New York City up here was all like woods, and that's where Washington was camped out. But lost the Battle of New York City, so lost two major ports early on in 1776. And has anybody ever been over the George Washington Bridge? Going from New Jersey to New York? It takes you from New Jersey into the Bronx. No? Maybe? Been to a Yankees game, you probably went over the George Washington Bridge.
Remember when I was going from New Jersey, we were going to the beach, and then we went up to a job at the airport, and then we went back to the Bronx.
So you may have gone over to the Verrazano instead. I don't know. I don't know which way you went. We have to look at Google Maps. Yeah, you were sleeping, so you don't know. But anyway, there's a bridge in New Jersey, and it goes from New Jersey into the Bronx and the northern part of Manhattan. It's called the George Washington Bridge because that's where George Washington's army, where the Continental Army, retreated from New York into New Jersey and down into Pennsylvania when they lost the Battle of New York. And that's why they needed the George Washington Bridge. Okay, it's just a little bit of trivia for you. So if you ever go over it, George Washington Bridge, that's a memory of George Washington's failure. Go America. All right? Okay. So, early on, 1776, we see that the British are winning at their strategy, right? Okay? And to point out to support Adams' claim about cutting off supplies, notice they're attacking port cities, right? These were major ports of importing things from around the world. So they were cutting off supplies, particularly to New England, right?
How was America getting new supplies other than
Philadelphia, major port, right? Baltimore. There were other ports as well that they could get things from around the world. Yeah, and smuggling. They smuggled things in. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right. So we go on. We go into now. Here's, as Sydney pointed out, kind of a two-pronged attack approach, right? So attack New England from the south along this river, and then also come in from Canada. All right. So we have the Battle of Ticonderoga there, which the British. There were two battles at Ticonderoga. The first one the British won. Okay. All right, and so again, 1776 in New England, it's kind of working well. Then, after George Washington's defeat here in New York, he retreated into New Jersey and then into Pennsylvania. The British came around from New York, and we'll go up to the map here. They came around from New York, down up through the Chesapeake Bay, and marched up through, marched up through Maryland, okay? And on their way to the next major port in the area, which was Philadelphia, right? And so they marched up here, and then we had the Battle of Brandywine, which is not far from here, okay? And then after the Battle of Brandywine, both the Continental Army and the British Army actually marched through our area. They marched through Royersford. Okay, Royersford was a crossing across the Schuylkill River. Ford, a way to get across the river. That's where it came from, getting from one side to the other. And so parts of the Continental Army and the British Army actually crossed here in Royersford. So
awesome
contribution, right? Okay, and so they cross the Battle of Brandywine, and then we get the battles of Germantown and Philadelphia. Okay, in late 1776. All right, both of which the British won. The victory at Philadelphia was particularly devastating for Americans, and why would that be the case? Why was that a particularly devastating loss for the Continental Army? Devin?
Because that's where Continental Congress met.
Yeah, that was the capital of the United States. Okay, that's where the government was meeting. That's where Congress met. And so Congress actually had to flee Philadelphia, and they went into Lancaster for a day, and then they went to York. And York was the capital of the United States for about a year during the Revolutionary War. Okay, they had to go inland. So again, you see, 1776 is not a good year for the Continental Army, is it?
No.
Okay, George Washington, you know, one of the things we said, he was an advantage in his leadership and his skill and his experience, but it's not paying off, huh? I mean, these are all losses in which Washington is commanding at least part of the army. Okay, and so that kind of shows you what we read in Building an Army, the inexperience of the Continental Army, right? Okay? Notice the British using the geography of American cities to their advantage. Right? Where are major American cities located? Andrew?
On the coast.
On the coast, right? And so the British taking advantage of that and occupying those places, and again, as Adam said, cutting off supplies. Okay? Alright. Late 1776, however, was a little minor turning point for the Continental Army. Everybody know which battle this is right here? Battle is that Sydney? Trenton. Okay, and what happened at Trenton? It's a very famous. Go ahead, Zach.
Washington invaded the British forces and went to Trenton and like surprised the British forces.
Very good.
Wasn't that kind of like a sly move because the armies didn't like normally they didn't actually fight during Christmas?
Yes. In fact, during the winter, at this time, it was kind of like an unspoken rule. You really didn't fight much during the winter. But yeah, Christmas was supposed to be a day off, right?
So we cheated.
He cheated.
A little bit, right? A little bit. Yeah, this is the famous Washington's Crossing, right? Across the Delaware. It's that famous picture of Washington on the bow of the boat with ice all around him, right? You guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Right? And I think there used to be a picture of it out in the lobby, but that's not there anymore. There might still be. But anyway, so, you know, the famous picture, and we surprised, and it wasn't actually the British, it was the Hessians. It was the Hessian army that he beat in Trenton. And they were taking the night off. They were actually having a little Christmas party. Okay? The Duke that was in charge of the Hessian army, this is an interesting little story about it. So, British intelligence actually warned the Hessians, this Hessian army, that the Continental Army was coming. But the Duke took the letter and just put it in his pocket because they were having a Christmas party. All right? And he was playing cards, and he was drinking some whiskey and wine and having a good time, and never bothered to read the letter. And then about 8 hours later, surprise, Christmas morning, here's George Washington and the Continental Army, and they took the Hessian armies by surprise. And they were a little fuzzy from the party that they just had, and it was chaotic, and it was a major victory. Now, why was this such a major victory for the United States? Adam?
Because the Hessians really supported the British a lot because they were like really highly trained mercenaries.
True. Agree. But let's look at the early course of the war. What's going on here? Zach?
Kind of shows that we have the capability to be we can be in the war.
It might be possible that we could turn it around, right? I mean, you look at all these early battles, they are losses, right? You're trying to, and Washington at the same time is trying to retain his soldiers. Remember Building an Army? Most of these guys signed up for a year. In 1777, half of his soldiers' re-enlistments were going to be done. They're going to be out. And he knew that if they didn't get a victory soon, most of them wouldn't re-enlist. And it was very possible that Congress would start talking about peace with Great Britain, that maybe we really can't win this war. Okay? So he knew, and said that's why he kind of cheated, as Andrew put it. He knew he needed a victory, something to go to his soldiers with, something to go to Congress with and say, look, we can do it. Okay? And that's why this was such an important victory, and why, like in American folklore, it's such an iconic moment for the Revolutionary War. Okay? And out of those, half of those soldiers, of those 50%, about half of those soldiers did re-enlist. Okay, so he did manage to keep about half of those people from leaving the army, and really saved his army at that point. Okay? Alright, then we go further in 1777, not long after that, in Princeton, another victory, okay, again against a combined Hessian-British force. Okay, a narrow victory, but still a victory nonetheless. So this is 2 in a row. And then, bless you, probably the most significant victory early on for Americans, Saratoga. Okay, and this is Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen and all those guys coming to the rescue on Lake Ticonderoga and taking down the British Navy. This actually was as much of a naval battle, believe it or not, as it was an infantry battle. A lot of it fought on the water. Okay. But an important victory because it turned back the British advance down the Hudson River, right? If the British win this battle, it's very likely that they succeed in getting their army to kind of go down the Hudson River and connect with their other army occupying New York, okay? And they succeed in cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies. But this victory turned the British back, and for the moment, made it possible that the Continental Army might be able to regain New York City, which was one of their goals. Okay? Make sense? Alright, Miles?
If British had this massive army, why didn't they just send some of their troops down to the middle colonies to also attack them there?
Say that again?
Why didn't they just bring some of their
Troops up?
Troops down to the middle colonies?
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Mostly because they didn't have enough. Okay.
Weren't they
It's
also
not that
fighting
many.
a war with another country
France.
at the same time as this? France, maybe.
Not yet, but we'll get there. Okay. All right.
I mean, no
Okay.
French joins in later.
Okay. So that's the New England campaign. All right. So hold on.
Washington.
So after 1777. The Continental Army goes to camp at Valley Forge. Okay, and following 1777, Continental Army starts to win some significant battles. All right, and the question is what changes? All right, what really happens at Valley Forge that leads Continental Army to change? This gentleman, you must know this name. He's a must know. Frederick Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand Baron von Steuben.
I'm not going to.
We just call him Frederick.
We call him the Baron von Steuben.
Okay, the
Baron
Baron
von
von
Okay.
Steuben.
Eric.
Who won the battle of Lexington?
Well, I don't know. We'll call it an American victory.
Oh, what? I labeled it as American.
Ferdinand.
So Frederick Wilhelm Augustus Heinrich Ferdinand Baron von Steuben. Okay, who was this guy? This guy. Do you know who he is?
I think was he when sent by the French to help train us?
Yes, but he wasn't French. He was actually German, Prussian. All right, he was from a part of Germany at the time called Prussia. So the Baron von Steuben, what he was, he basically was a mercenary. He had been a sergeant in the Prussian army, which at the time was the best army in the world, most organized, most professional army in the world. And after his time serving in the Prussian army, he left and he started to outsource himself or contract himself to armies around the world so they could learn how to be like the Prussian army. Okay, he was basically like a coach, if you will. Okay, so the French had hired him to start training their soldiers. All right, he had gone through that process. All right. After the battle, during the Revolution, as soon as the Declaration of Independence was signed, the United States sent ambassadors to France to try to convince them to join our cause. Right? Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson were among some of the ambassadors that went there. Silas Deane was another one. To try to convince the French to give us money, to give us troops, to give us help. Right? After the Battle of Saratoga, the French finally said, yes, we want to get involved. And what incentive would the French have to get involved anyway? Why would they even want to get involved in the American Revolution? John?
Because they hated the British too.
They disliked the British. Why? Velaz?
Because the British already beat them in the war.
Going back to the French and Indian Wars, right? And the wars in North America, where the British had won, right? So this was an opportunity for payback. So the French gave the United States about $2 million, all right? Pledged about 10,000 troops. But that wasn't going to get there immediately. Remember, it took a lot of time to get across the ocean. Who they did send immediately, though, with that agreement, was this gentleman, Frederick Wilhelm Augustus Heinrich Baron von Steuben. Okay, and they sent him to train the United States military at Valley Forge. And this is really what makes Valley Forge such a significant moment in the Revolution. Right? We know there was no battle at Valley Forge, right? And we read about all the horrible conditions, and everyone knows, oh, the winter at Valley Forge was so tough, right? The significant thing that came out of Valley Forge was the training of the United States Army. Okay? Now, Baron von Steuben didn't speak any English. Okay? He spoke French. So he had an interpreter that would go around with him. And he would speak French, and the French interpreter would then speak English. And that's how he translated things. But von Steuben shows up, and so Benjamin Franklin, first, this is a little story about von Steuben. It's a good story, all right? So he shows up, and Franklin's writing letters, and he's talking von Steuben up, and he's calling him I think he said he was a colonel or something in the Prussian army, which was like a big deal. If you're a colonel in the Prussian army, you're a bad dude, all right? So he's talking him up. He's like, wow, this guy was like a colonel or a general or something, and tells Washington this. Well, it turns out that he wasn't. He was a sergeant. Okay.
Not bad. Not bad.
Still not bad. But anyway, Franklin kind of talked him up. But anyway, so von Steuben was walking around, and he just observed for the first 2 weeks he was there. He just kind of watched what was going on. And he noticed that most of the day, the Continental soldiers did nothing at Valley Forge. Like, they didn't do anything. They sat around. And von Steuben was like, well, wait a minute. Aren't you an army, right? You're being paid to do this. You need to practice. And he said that's what made the Prussian army so good, is they drilled. They drilled. They got up, they drilled, they took a break, they drilled, took another break, and they drilled. They drilled all day. They practiced, right? Any of you in here that are athletes or musicians know, if you want to be good at it, you got to practice, right? You can't just kind of do it. You got to get really good at it. So what von Steuben did was he took 100 soldiers from for the Continental Army, and he trained them how to be a soldier, how to march, how to fight, how to be able to fire 3 shots out of a single load weapon in 1 minute. Basically, how to be a good soldier. And then he took those 100 soldiers and had them train groups of men until eventually the whole army was trained. Then von Steuben wrote a manual, the United States Military Training Manual, which was the basis, still the basis for the United States Army. Okay? And the foundation of it all is you must train. You must drill. So Valley Forge turned into a place of soldiers just sitting around doing nothing, to a place where they drilled and drilled and drilled and drilled and marched and marched and marched and marched and did this and did that and shot weapon, all that kind of stuff. That's why a lot of the soldiers started to complain, because it's like, man, we're working hard, right? But it paid off, okay? Because after Valley Forge, Washington's army starts to win some significant battles, okay? And the war starts to change a little bit. Because now they're actually finally fighting the British with a trained professional army. Does that make sense? All right? The other thing that happened at Valley Forge, I mentioned it yesterday, was counterintelligence. George Washington was really good at it. He sent out a whole bunch of fake letters that he knew were going to get intercepted by British spies to make the British think that the Revolutionary Army was basically giving up. If you would have read those letters, you would have thought that half the army had died, they're all starving, they have no supplies, and that basically the Revolutionary War was lost. Okay? Washington wanted the British to think that when they met the Continental Army on the battlefield the next time, that the British would win without any problems. Okay? and that wasn't the case. When they met, you see this white dot up there on the map, Monmouth, 1778. That's where the Continental Army and the British met for the first time after Valley Forge. It's white because it's a draw, meaning that nobody won, nobody lost. The Continental Army met the full British Army on the battlefield and held their own. Okay, and it was a significant kind of moral victory for Washington's army. Okay, make sense? All right. Okay, so that was the New England campaign. All right, so if we go back to the map and we kind of look at the situation, this is the Revolutionary War from 1776 into 1778, kind of taking place here. In 1778, the Revolutionary War in this part kind of stalls out. Washington starts camping outside of New York City, and the British occupy New York, and not much really happens in this part of the war in 1778. The reason why? Because the British changed their focus. Okay? They're like, all right, so we kind of stalled a little bit in New England, so let's try the South. Right? Now, why would the British think that they might be able to win in the South a little bit easier than in New England? What do you think that? Devin?
There's a lot more loyalists in the South.
Bingo. They thought there'd be a loyalist uprising, and there's not as many patriots. They're going to quit, and they're not. It'll be easier in the South. All right. So the British send Lord General Cornwallis to South Carolina. Okay, in which he invades Charleston, wins easily. Savannah wins easily. And Camden wins easily. And it looks like the British plan is going to work. And Cornwallis' job is to conquer the South, rain a path of destruction up through here, and then eventually meet up with the other British army somewhere around Philadelphia. Okay? And at that point, the colonies will be destroyed, and the war will be over, and they'll crush the rebellion. Right? Adam?
About a question. After Valley Forge, did the Baron von Steuben stay with the army? Did he go back? Or
No, he
he
stayed
stayed
for a
and
while,
was like a state like a tactician for George Washington?
Advisor, yeah. Yep.
Yes.
But at the time, didn't Cornwallis fail at Long Island?
Well, yeah. The reason they sent him is because, his unit didn't achieve their objective, so he was kind of
Chance.
reassigned, to the South. All right, but he was a very well-respected general and still a great general. So they're giving this.
Funny name.
All right, so in the South, Cornwallis is winning until the Cowpens. Okay, and this battle right here is the Cowpens in South Carolina. In the South, there really wasn't a Continental Army. Most of the Continental Army was up in northern New Jersey, camped outside of New Jersey. There were only about 2,000 regular Continental soldiers in the South. The rest of the army in the South was militia. And the South Carolina militia, led by Francis Marion, who they called the Swamp Fox, decided there is no way that we're going to have farmers and regular guys who are not part of the regular trained Continental Army fight the British on the battlefield. There's no way we're going to win. Okay? It's like having the 76ers play the San Antonio Spurs. Okay? It's just not, there's no chance in them winning. Okay? The Sixers, by the way, not winning. So, Francis Marion decided, let's use guerrilla war. Okay? And so going back to my reference to Afghanistan before, okay? In Afghanistan, fighting the United States, the Afghanis don't have the same military technology, the military power, and the wealth that the United States does, right? But they've been able to make the war go on since 2003. Why? Because they use guerrilla war. They use the terrain to their advantage, their knowledge of the land, right? And in guerrilla war, you never really engage your opponent on a battlefield. You kind of hide and you pick off a few people there, you put some bombs on the side of the road. You kind of are more of a nuisance than anything else. Okay? Does that make sense? That's what the South Carolina and the Southern militia was doing. All right? And eventually, they were able to start winning some engagements against the British. And the Cowpens is one of those engagements. We'll see in the Patriot, when we watch the Patriot, we'll see exactly how they were able to win the Battle of Cowpens. Okay? All right.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
What were the cities? I'm trying to write them down. So
Charleston, Savannah, and Camden.
Oh,
Camden, yeah, like Camden, Philadelphia. This is
Yeah.
Camden, South Carolina. Okay.
Okay.
All right, and then after that, the United States, we win another battle here. You see it over here, Kings Mountain. So this is the Cowpens, Kings Mountain. Notice the trend, right? The United States knew they were not going to defeat Cornwallis. What they were trying to do was slow his advance northward until the French showed up. That was their goal. And it was working. Okay, because this battle here is the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. This is in late 1788, almost 1789. And then eventually, Cornwallis retreats or moves north, but he only gets as far as Yorktown, Virginia. Okay? Now in Yorktown, Cornwallis decides to entrench himself, build a giant fort in Yorktown, and kind of get himself set in there for like a major battle. Alright? George Washington was able to secretly sneak away from his encampment outside of New York and get down there and meet up with the army in the South. And then finally at Yorktown, our friends, the French, arrive. And there's a massive engagement at Yorktown, a massive siege of Yorktown that lasts in 1780 and 81, that lasts several months. All right? And the combination of the French Navy, the French Army, Washington's army secretly sneaking down, and the other Continental Army, they're able to defeat Cornwallis. And one major British army is defeated. Now the war doesn't end, but after the Battle of Yorktown, the British sit down with Continental Congress and start talking about peace. And it's clear that that the British aren't going to be able to put down this rebellion. And so they start talking about terms of how are we going to peacefully end the Revolutionary War. Okay? And then in 1783 is when the Revolutionary War officially ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Okay? Adam.
The city before Yorktown.
This is Guilford Courthouse. It's up here on the map. Guilford Courthouse. Yep. And then this is Yorktown. Okay? Sean.
So what were the loyalists in the southern colonies doing the entire time?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So a lot of loyalists did join the British Army. Okay, a lot of them served as soldiers, and they did support. A lot of them acted as spies and tried to find out, where was the South Carolina militia working, where was the Continental Army going. So they worked in that capacity. Okay, this is a good question. Okay, so that's the story of the Revolutionary War. Okay, with some of the major battles and how it played out. So the British strategy again was to cut off New England. It didn't work. Then their strategy was to come down south and connect up with their army in New York, from New York and Philadelphia. That didn't work. Okay? For the United States, their plan was to make the war last as long as possible and get allies to help them win the war. And one of those key alliances was France. Okay? France helped it with money, they helped out with troops, and the Battle of Yorktown is kind of the decisive battle in 1780. Which kind of basically ends the Revolutionary War. Okay, there's some fighting after that, because there's still another British army here in New York, but pretty much that ends the revolution. Okay, does that make sense, Adam?
I know how Benedict Arnold becomes a traitor. When does that happen throughout this, and how does that affect the war?
Yeah, so I don't remember the exact year. I think it happens in 1778, 1789. Yeah, his wife convinces him to switch sides because it doesn't look like America's going to win, and he gets promised a lordship and all that stuff, and he joins the British Army. He gives up West Point, which is in New York, somewhere around here, and it was a West Point somewhere around there. An embarrassing loss for America. Fortunately, it didn't have too much bearing on the outcome of the war. It was more of a psychological loss than anything else.
Like this great, like one of our greatest guys are.
Yeah, because New York City had already been lost at that point. Like it was clear that we weren't. But West Point was an important fort that maybe we'd be able to regain New York City, right? And that's what Washington knew. Well, West Point, somebody's like, all right, well, we're not getting New York, so what are we going to do, right? And when Cornwallis entrenches in Yorktown and the French arrive, Washington's like, all right, so we don't have West Point, we can sneak down and let's try to get Cornwallis there, because we're not taking New York the way that they're entrenched. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So he just moved to England after they won the war.
After they won the war, he moved to
I mean,
England.
after we won.
After we won the war, he moved to England. He stays part of the military, and then he'll actually come back in the War of 1812. Benedict Arnold actually invades Washington D.C. and is part of the army that burns the White House.
Bruh.
Did we kill him?
No, but
Oh,
James was it James Madison, or I forget who it was. Somebody said about Benedict Arnold, like, what would happen if you came across Benedict Arnold and killed him or captured him or whatever? Like, well, if we killed him, we would cut off his right leg and bury it with full military honors, because his right leg was wounded at the Battle of Saratoga in that major victory, and so that part was a great. That part of him was a great American.
Oh.
Right. Okay. All right. So here's what I want you to do. We just have a question here, kind of sum up this little lecture. So how was America able to win the war? Okay. So if you have some room on your Revolutionary War battle map, you can answer that question. If not, put this question in your notebook. Okay, and just think based on what I talked about, what you read in the section related to the map. How was America actually able to win the Revolutionary War? Okay.